Waglisi, everyone. My name is Cassie Rose Mitchell, and I have the pleasure of being your host of today's episode of From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. Today's guest is Jeff Mitchell. Jeff is a former tribal leader for the Klamath tribes. He's a longtime natural resource protector, and he has been involved with the historic dam removal happening along the Klamath River since the very beginning of the whole process. Currently manager of Indigenous Initiative and chairman of the Klamath Tribes Culture and Heritage Committee. Also, a full disclosure, Jeff is my Patisup. He is my father, and I just wanted to let you all know that. So today we're going to be talking about the incredible work that's been happening along the Klamath River regarding the removal of several dams over the last 25 years. Hi, Dad.
Hey.
So first of all, can you give a little bit of context of when and why the rivers were dammed and why it was an issue?
Boy, we have to go back to really cover that issue, and it really kind of goes with settlement by our new neighbors, people that moved into the basin. And it really started back in the Gold Rush era. Various communities got developed, and as time moved on, after the turn of a century, of course, there was communities growing. People needed services, and power was right at the top of that list. People in Northern California looked at the Klamath River as a resource and really decided to move forward with a hydroelectric project to meet the power needs of their community. And, that started around 1910. From there, it really blossomed. And it was more of a regional effort led by private investment. They actually funded the project and designed the first dam on the Klamath River, which became known as Copco 1. The company they formed was called California-Oregon Public Utility. So that dam was started around 1914. The actual construction finished up in 1917. Unfortunately, during the design of that project, one of a fundamental design change occurred, and that was dropping fish ladders from the design of the project. And unfortunately, in doing that, it completely blocked the Klamath River and stopped all the anadromous fish from being able to move up to their historical spawning grounds, which is where I live. And so that was the beginning of the development on the Klamath. And it didn't stop there. It went on. But with that very first dam, it completely blocked salmon, chials, as we call them in our language, up to our homeland.
And what was the impact on the tribal nations? Was there opposition at that time?
The Klamath tribes, and the Klamath tribes really consist of three tribes, the Klamath Modoc and Yehuskan Band of Snake. The three tribes entered into a treaty with the United States in 1864, and that treaty was ratified by Congress, signed off by the President in 1872. In that treaty, we ceded to the United States over 23 million acres of land that was historical homelands of the three tribes. We did retain a homeland of 2.2 million acres, and that was meant to provide a homeland for our people in perpetuity, and unfortunately that didn't happen. But the steps of moving forward on the Klamath with that first project that they developed, we weren't trying to stop any of our new neighbors from, having the benefits of power and electricity. Our only request was that if you build the dam needed to allow for fish passage. Unfortunately, it was empty words. Now, the impacts of that was immediate. I mean, salmon chials actually provided roughly 1/4 of all of our subsistence needs. Our people are hunters, fishers, and gatherers. We never farmed. We never had to. The Creator had blessed us and given us everything we needed. We just had to go out and gather it. And we're fish people. Our primary resource that we depended on is fish. Everything from salmon to trout to other types of fish. We call them chwam, cockatoo, and yen, or more of a bottom fish, a whitefish. And all of those fish, eels, they provided and met the needs of our people. You can imagine when that's taken away instantaneously, as it was, when people went down to the river expecting to catch fish in 1917, to their amazement, there were no salmon in the river. It completely devastated our people. And it was a beginning of tremendous hardship and something that we still continue to deal with to the present day. It's been 107 years and growing since we've had salmon in our homelands. That's been a big loss, and we're certainly looking forward to the day when those fish will be back, which will hopefully be soon, now that dams are coming out.
And how did conventional agriculture farms in the area affect the water, the land, and the salmon?
Well, it was all about land, of course. When we signed a treaty with the United States in 1864, it came on the heels of the Civil War that the United States had to go through. And as the war ended, everybody looked to the West and felt that, that was really the future for the United States. The United States was pretty much broke after the Civil War, and they needed to do a lot of rebuilding. And they also had a lot of people who had fought in the war that needed homes. And because of that, a lot of actions were taken by the United States. The Homestead Act, the Dawes Allotment Act, that also affected tribes across the nation and gobbled up tremendous amounts of Indian land. Other actions were taken to meet the needs of people at the time. And as they looked to the West, they looked at the natural resources of the region. And our people were blessed with a tremendous amount of resources, in particular timber, besides a tremendous amount of water. So Congress, the United States, started looking and making plans and passing new laws like the Reclamation Act, really laid the foundation for the future development. And how that played out here, we ended up with a reclamation project that started in 1905. And during the early development of that reclamation project, it was funded through the United States. And, it created roughly 280,000 acres of farmland eventually, and it drained 2 large lakes completely and turned those into farmlands. These lakes were all part of the hydrology of the upper basin. We had a number of lakes in the upper basin, primarily 3 large lakes: Upper Klamath Lake, Lower Klamath Lake, and Tule Lake. Tule Lake and Lower Klamath Lake were the lakes that we lost completely. The change was rapid, and it was tremendous. And the consequences and impacts on other resources were immediate. So ag played a big part in how we ended up to where we are today. And of course, we still have a significant amount of agriculture in the Upper Klamath Basin today. The reclamation project is about 280,000 acres. You have about 1,500 farms that operate within those boundaries of that project. And outside of that project, who we refer to as the off-project agricultural community, they probably farm and ranch another 300,000 acres of lands in the Upper Klamath Basin. So they really replumbed the whole upper basin. The whole hydrology of Upper Klamath was changed to accommodate the needs of agriculture and ranching interests. So those are the effects of that type of progress, I guess is what they want to call it.
Yeah, they completely changed the ecosystem.
Yes, they did. Our people have been here for over 15,000 years. We live in a balance with the lands, and we have a saying here that the land is us. and we are the land, and the same as the water. We're water people. We've only took what we needed, never anymore, and that balance quickly changed with our new neighbors moving in and working to meet the needs that they brought with them.
And what kind of work did you and your colleagues do to ensure that the dam removal process would happen? And how were the tribal members involved with this process also?
The Klamath Hydroelectric Project was scheduled to be relicensed prior to 2006. The current license that they were operating under was a 50-year license that actually started in 1957, the year I was born. The proponents, the owners of the dam project at that time, which was still Pacific Corp, they had prepared an application and had received a license to continue to operate and also build new dams in 1957. So that license would expire 50 years later, which was roughly 2006. And 1999, Pacific Corp started preparing to resubmit a new license application to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we were contacted by Pacific Corp, who asked to meet with us and talk about any concerns that we would have with them seeking a renewal of that license, and invited us to sit down at a table and talk with them about our concerns. And of course, for our people, the primary issue centered on fish passage and bringing salmon home. So we look at the relicensing of this project as really an opportunity for us to fix a past wrong, to bring salmon back to the upper basin, and really bring the Klamath tribes back into what I call Salmon Nation, and again have a resource that could help meet the subsistence needs of the Klamath tribe. So 1999 is when we started this work, and we had ended up spending the next 20, 25 years working towards addressing the issue of fish passage. And it took many twists and turns over that time. It eventually culminated with an agreement to remove the dams, but a lot happened to get to that point. And we were never certain we would ever get dams out. First, we were looking at how can we just get fish passage.
I remember, yeah, I remember all of that. And I remember that it was a lot of meetings with downriver tribes and a lot of coordinating and working with them. And there was a lot on the legal side with the government. And then there was a lot of trying to make our voice heard about how important this was for us.
Yeah, boy, a couple of really significant things happened. But one thing that we'd have to note is that out of all the tribes that reside along the Klamath, the tribe that was impacted the most was the Klamath tribes. We live at the headwaters. So when that first dam was built in the mid-Klamath back in 1917, it totally blocked salmon to our homeland. So we lost immediately 25% of our food source. The lower river tribes, though, continued to fish. They still had access to salmon. And what really concerned them, though, was particularly in the last 50 years, they've seen a gradual decline in salmonids. And we're talking about different species of salmon. In particular, coho, they were eventually listed under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. So for the downriver tribes, they were equally interested in how the project would move forward and how relicensing would work. And they looked at it from their lens downriver of wanting to take actions that would protect resources that they still had. Unlike the Klamath tribes, we were looking at it as how can we get resources that we had totally lost? Because losing 25% of your food source, meant that we had to rely more heavily on the resources that were left. So we had to start hunting more. We had to depend on other fisheries more. that were still in the upper basin, those fish were also experiencing detriment. In particular, a whitefish up here we call our chwam, cockatoo. Those fish are the first fish that run in the spring. Those are the fish that our people really depended on after long, hard winters. We always knew that if we could make it to early spring, the Creator would bless us with those fish. Now, because of the development of farmland, the draining of lakes, the replumbing of the upper basin, there's not one river in the upper basin that hasn't been affected in one manner or another. So we've had one impact after another. All of this is a gradual decline in our ability to meet our most basic needs. So for us, we looked at dam relicensing as an opportunity to maybe reset the course of at least some of those species, in particular salmonids. If we could move the Klamath hydroelectric project in a direction where they would at least install fish ladders, we could maybe get salmonids back up into our homeland again. Because under our treaty we signed with the United States, we only reserved a right to gather critical resources, treaty protected resources within the boundaries of the Klamath Indian Reservation. And we can't go outside of those boundaries to meet our subsistence needs. So it was pretty clear to us that if we were to do anything positive, it needed to start within this process. But boy, it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, and it seemed like even recently, I wasn't even sure if the dam removal was going to happen. It got scary at some points because it seemed like it kept getting pushed back, it kept getting put off, and I just because it's been such a long fight, just thinking, I don't really know if this is going to happen. Knowing how important it is to the tribal people of the area. So to see it happening has been probably one of the most beautiful things I've seen in my lifetime.
It's been pretty amazing, but it didn't happen as we originally looked at it. It did go through a series of changes. Pacific Corps started developing their draft license application in 1999. We worked with them. The lower tribes worked with Pacific Corps for 5 years, and I think it was 2005. They submitted that draft license to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And to our amazement, all of the portions of the application that dealt with fish passage was left out. We actually spent 1 week out of every month in meetings with Pacific Corps on their draft license application for 5 years. We spent a tremendous amount of resources towards trying to find some common ground with this company, and downriver tribes equally were also involved. And this process we went through was a process that Pacific Corps invited us into. It was their choice whether or not they wanted to include us in the development of their application. They knew that once their application ended up in FERC's hands, that there would be hearings, and they wanted to make sure that they had an agreement with the tribes prior to that point in the process. Somewhere along that line, though, they made a really big decision to drop everything involving fish passage that we thought was going to be part of that application. They took out. So it was like being stabbed in the back. Now, some other things happened that contributed towards big change. We have this big reclamation project in the headwaters up here. And they were taking probably 80% of all of the available water and diverting it down to that project. That had enormous impacts on the river itself, and species within that river were being impacted by water quality and quantity issues. And it all came to a head in 2001 in the middle of a drought where with this reclamation project in particular, because we have endangered species and threatened species, you have involvement by other agencies, you have NOAA, who oversees salmonids, you have U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that oversees the health of freshwater fish, and we had listed species in both those areas. So under the Endangered Species Act, these projects were required to take into consideration how that project would impact those threatened species. And what happened in 2001 was unprecedented because prior to that, ag was taking always as much water as they wanted, whenever they wanted. But policy and laws were changing, and we entered into a significant drought. And because of that, a decision was made not to provide any water allocation to agricultural interests in the upper basin. And water got shut off, and it became the focus of a national issue. The Klamath River Basin became ground zero over water. They called them the water wars, and still do. There's a lot of other issues that contributed, including what we call adjudication. And our tribes got pulled into that when they decided to move forward with adjudication. We filed our claims for water to protect our fish and wildlife and plant life that are first foods. And when it came to making those decisions, the courts agreed that the Klamath tribes did retain the first right to water. And we were the most senior water right holder in the Klamath Basin. All of these issues impact one another. And so when it got around to water allocation, adjudication, a decision was made to turn that water off to the project. And the outrage by the non-tribal public was tremendous. People across the nation traveled to the Klamath Basin to protest those decisions. And during this whole process, we're also involved in this relicensing of these dams. So you have all of these issues involving all these natural resources occurring at the same time. It was like the perfect storm starting to evolve. And in 2001, it blew up. And then decisions were made in 2001 by the Bush administration to reverse their decision about water allocation, and they decided to give water back to ag. And they started dewatering the system again during the drought. And the tribes all warned the United States that if you dewater the system in drought like this, that it would have huge impacts, and more likely we would have fish kills. And our words were ignored within the United States. The Department of Interior, within the Bureau of Reclamation, all of these entities that were responsible for fish and water management bowed to the political interests and made decisions to change all of that. So in 2002, the pendulum swung back the other way, and water got delivered to the project. And in fact, in 2002, we experienced the biggest fish kill in the history of the United States. We had close to 100,000 adult salmon returning to the Klamath that died because of diseases and lack of water, lack of clean water.
Hello listeners, Zachariah here. I just wanted to share one of my favorite sites for buying Indigenous art and learning about Indigenous artists. An Indigenous woman-owned and operated business, ProjectAntelope.com is an innovative online marketplace that features fine arts, fashion, books, music, and home goods. If you like to support Indigenous art and artists, ProjectAntelope.com is a great place to start. Tell them I sent you.
And what are the main products that the conventional agriculture produces in the basin?
You know, they produce a variety of different foods, from potatoes to mint, horseradish, alfalfa, just a wide variety of crops. And some of the crops that they grow require a tremendous amount of water. And we live in a semi-arid area. We live in a high desert, you know, and the areas that they chose to farm in, they literally had to drain lakes completely to make that land available. And then the water that was left, they built extensive canal systems to those lands. So nothing flows up here like it used to flow. And those are other associated issues to what we're dealing with. But the fish kill of 2002, it was the biggest fish kill that anybody had ever seen in the history of this country. Back during all of this, we still had the license, and we were working with Pacific Corp, and we felt we had an agreement with them where they would build fish ladders on every dam they put in on the Klamath. You have Iron Gate that went in 1962. That's the first dam on the Klamath that blocks fish. Copco Dam, the very first dam, is above that. That was built in 1917. Shortly after that, Copco 2 was built. You go further upriver and you get to J.C. Boyle. And once you cross over into Oregon, you have the largest hydroelectric dam in the whole system. And that was built in the late 50s. And then above that, you have Keno Dam and you have Link River Dam. So all of these dams needed to have fish ladders. So the draft license that we thought was going to be submitted would have called for the build out of these ladders. Pacific Corp started looking at the cost, and they made the decision within the company that it simply would cost too much money to put in fish ladders. How they came to that decision was a closely guarded secret of theirs, but I can only assume that it had to do with the amount of power that the dams produce, the amount of capital that is returned, revenue. So they simply submitted a license that was really the status quo. And that's when the tribes made that decision that, hey, if this is the way you're going to work with us, we ain't settling for nothing less now than complete dam removal. And I recall that meeting with downriver tribal leaders. We were actually in Orleans, California, a small tribal community of the Karuk people, and there was 12 of us, the Yurok, Hupa Valley, Karuk, and Klamath tribes. And it was probably the lowest point in the whole process when we realized that we had been stabbed in the back by Pacific Corp. All of the NGOs that had been working with us, all these environmental groups that had pledged support during the relicensing process, they all kind of gave up the fight and said, well, we fought a good fight, folks, but it looks like we're going to have to settle for something less. And in that meeting, we looked at each other. We realized that the only way our tribes were going to survive is if those dams had to be taken out, at least the majority of them. And so we made a commitment that day between the four tribes that we'd all work together towards that goal of dam removal. And that fight would now go on for the next decade practically and take the four tribes around the world. We started alone by ourselves with one group supporting us. Friends of the River in California was the only NGO environmental group that didn't walk away.
And where is the process at now? How will freeing and restoring the rivers heal the land, the water, the people, and the salmon?
You know, the tribes had to gear up tremendously, and we had to find resources to help us define a path and a direction, an argument that we could stand on, that we could gain support with as well. Because even though it's supposed to be a process that looks at science and conditions as they are now, the reality of it is a lot of it's political, and decisions that involve these kinds of resources at that level are made back in Washington, D.C. They're made in Sacramento, the capital of California, and Salem, the capital of Oregon. And what it really meant for the four tribes is that we had to engage all of those parties. And we also had to look outside to the parties that depended on water. because besides fish, this was also about water. And water is the lifeblood of this earth. And contrary to what people were trying to say, that fish didn't need water, they do need water, and they need good, clean water. And we had to start focusing on how we could gain support and how we could build a case. And you think that would be simple, but it was actually the most difficult work I was ever engaged with. It was a negotiation. We ended up having to work with Oregon and California. We had to work with their DEQs. We had to look at their clean water policy, their fisheries policy. We use those policies within the relicensing process. In the end, we convinced the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to issue what they call mandatory conditions that have to be met before they would issue a license to PacifiCorp. And the biggest mandatory condition was that there had to be fish passage. FERC agreed that under the current laws and under our treaties, that PacifiCorp had an obligation to provide fish passage. Second, because of the Clean Water Act, PacifiCorp needed to obtain permits both from Oregon and California that their projects would not create points of pollution and they wouldn't be detrimental to water quality. And that's pretty dang hard to do with dams because dams do impact water quality greatly. And as PacifiCorp looked at those policies on the state level, I think they realized quickly that they were never going to get a permit out of either Oregon or California. So now it became, how do we get out of this as whole as possible with the least amount of impact to our shareholders and our company? And once we got to that point, it became a negotiation. And we would spend the next 8 years from 2006 on working on an agreement, a settlement. And we were successful eventually. We ended up negotiating what is referred to today as the Klamath Hydro Settlement Act. And that act is an act that allows PacifiCorp to walk away from this project, unfortunately, with not very much liability, if any at all. But they surrendered their license to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we had to come up with a solution. Who would take over that license, and how would you go forward with removing the dams? And it became, okay, how do we fund dam removal? Because somebody's going to have to pay that bill. And PacifiCorp refused to be responsible for it. They said, if we're going to have to pay for dam removal, we're going to fight it for years to come. And the tribes had to look at that and look at other decisions. And we knew that they had the power to probably keep this in that state of flux for a significant amount of time, maybe decades. And what we also knew is that our fish couldn't survive without significant change. The current species that were still left were getting worse by the year. And if it would take 10, 20 years to force PacifiCorp into paying for dam removal, we may not have fish left by the time we got to that point. And so we had to take a step back and say, okay, we don't like it. We're going to have to hold our nose. But if we can come up with an agreement that allows PacifiCorp to surrender their license, great. Then it's a matter of creating an entity to come in behind that would be responsible for removal. And we did that. With that agreement, we created a company and it submitted a license to take the dams out. And we raised the money, $500 million, to cover the cost of what now is being regarded as the largest dam removal in the history of the world, and restore those areas where the dams once stood. We're currently in that process right now. We've hired Kiewit, one of the largest construction companies in the world, to come in and dismantle those dams. And they've in fact started that. One dam is completely out. Copco 2, the smallest dam in the system, is gone. The other 3 dams have been breached. The reservoirs behind them have been drained. Now we're waiting for the spring runoff to complete and flows go back to normal, and then we'll proceed with taking the other 3 dams apart. We will take out the 3 remaining dams by fall of this year, but right now there is volitional fish passage. Fish can start swimming up the river, and in fact, I looked at a report just the other day that actually seeing fish are actually starting to move through the system. We knew that there would be impacts with sedimentation and other issues associated with removal, but we brought in the best scientists and construction people in the world, and the plans that they've developed appear to be well thought out, and it's working. So
I have a special guest here. She's joining.
I see her.
And appreciates all of the hard work that's been going into this, and hopefully she'll be able to gather some salmon on her homelands.
And that's what it's all about. I hope to be here to be able to see a salmon swim by my home, my community here in Chiloquin, Oregon, right. And I want to be able to walk down the river and actually see a fish go by. If I live long enough to see that, I'm going to be a happy man. But what I know is that it took a long time for people to screw this system up, and it's going to take a while to fix it yet. And hopefully she'll be able to fish for salmon. She's going to be part of Salmon Nation, and she'll be a future fisher.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
It has. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your podcast. And for all your listeners out there, I hope that maybe if they ever make it out here to Oregon and California, that they visit the Klamath Basin and particularly the Upper Basin, and maybe they'll get a chance to see steelhead and salmon in the rivers up here. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but now it's we're on the path to getting those dams out, and who knows? Maybe the next dams will be on the Columbia. They get removed, or on the Snake, or someplace else.
Well, Subcatcha for tuning in, and Subcatcha Patissa. I'm Cassie Rose Mitchell, and you have been listening to From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast app or at We Are the Seeds YouTube channel.
Thank you for having me. You folks have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. Please subscribe, share with a friend, and leave us a review. You'll be helping us grow our listener community and elevate the impact of our podcast. You can learn more about this podcast at wearetheseeds.org. From Here with a View is executive produced by Michelle St. John with Zachariah Julian and Tyler Nagoyo producing. Sound mixing and original theme music by Zachariah Julian. To listen to more from Zachariah, follow him on Spotify and Apple Music. From Here with a View logo art was inspired by an original oil pastel drawing by artist Jason Weesaw. Graphic design by Fernanda Leon. This podcast was funded in part by Independence Public Media Foundation. We'll see you next time on From Here with a View.